Hello everybody and welcome back to another new episode of the Grid Girls Formula and F1 podcast. I'm your host Zoe, and today we have a very exciting episode in store. We're going to be recapping the rather dramatic Spanish Grand Prix that took place this past weekend, and we are also going to be doing a technical tidbit diving into a little bit more about dirty air as well as slipstream and how those two kind of are one and the same but operate a little bit differently. Also, I just got my hair cut, and usually nobody gets to see this because it's like late at night, but I literally just got back from the salon. So if you're watching on YouTube, you get to see my nice new haircut. Let's start by diving into some news that took place before the race weekend. There was a new rule that was implemented for wing flexibility. Basically, teams are able to gain an advantage and like a little mini DRS system by having more flexible wings. And so the stewards have tightened up their rules surrounding this, and they checked this actually with a deflection test, and I'll put a picture on the screen now of some of the visuals that they had on the F1 article that I was reading because they actually look pretty interesting. They basically put a load on the wing and it only is allowed to deflect by a certain amount, whether it's a little bit different whether they're putting a load on both sides of the wing or just on one side of the wing. But it's actually kind of cool to see how they do that. Also, if you were listening to the international commentary for F1 TV, then you know that we had Nico Rosberg commentating, who honestly, he's so funny, first of all. Second of all, though, like he is so much more technical, I think, than the commentators I typically listen to. So it was interesting to hear his take on a lot of things, and I was just like very intrigued by a lot of what he had to say. So I will probably be referencing him quite a lot in today's episode. We're gonna speed through the practice because honestly, we have a lot of things to talk about during the race. We had a new rookie on the field during free practice 1. We had Victor Martins, who was trying out Alex Albon's Williams. Just a reminder, all of the teams have to run a rookie at least twice per car per season, so that's 4 times total for the year. And all of the practice sessions were basically dominated by the McLarens, so really nothing that crazy to talk about there. Let's start by diving into Q1. So Q1, we had a couple of knockouts that I don't think we were expecting. So Sainz qualified the worst that he ever has at his home Grand Prix, which sucks because whenever you're at home, obviously you want to really impress the crowd more than you do on a regular day. I mean, every race is important for these guys, but especially whenever you're at home. So it was really sad to see that happen. And a lot of that was because of Colapinto, who actually just got kind of stuck in the pits, and everybody was lining up behind him, and it looked like me trying to merge into traffic. Like everybody was backed up, the Williams were like going around him, it was a whole thing, but because of that, there was just a lot more traffic on the track. First of all, they got pushed back time-wise, but then everybody on the track was in their way, so they had to pass over a lot of cars during their push lap, which put Sainz in not a very great position, unfortunately, and so he was out during Q1. We also had Tsunoda, who was really struggling as well. He was in last place. He qualified last, and by the sounds of it, he thought he had done like a relatively decent lap, so that definitely sucks, and it really I just don't understand what is going on with that second Red Bull seat. It just cannot hold a person. I've heard some people say like over and over like, oh, like this is designed for Max, it's so tailored to Max's needs. But during the race and qualifying and everything, all we hear is Max complaining. I don't think that car is necessarily tailored to his needs either. I just think that he is maybe a little bit more flexible and able to adapt to that type of car. I don't think that they have designed it for him. I think that car is just really, really hard to drive. And for some reason, they can put some really talented people in that car, and it's just not working out for them. I think a lot of people owe Checo an apology, actually, because I was rooting for him all last year, and I was like, you know what? He sucks at the minute, but that's because of the Red Bull car and because of this seat that just is cursed and nobody can hold it. I did a whole Instagram post on this, actually, a little while ago, and I don't even think it goes back to Danny Ricciardo that this seat is cursed. Like, it goes back even further than that. My theory is actually Mark Webber was the one who cursed this seat because he was the second driver or whatever to Sebastian Vettel, and then he didn't do very well. And then there were some other people in the second seat. Danny Kvyat, I know, was like the second driver basically to Daniel Ricciardo for a while, and then Kvyat couldn't hold the seat and he got kicked out and replaced by Verstappen. And at that point, I think Verstappen swapped the role, and Verstappen became the number 1 driver and Daniel Ricciardo became the number 2 driver, and then we all know how that's gone basically since then. Anyway, long story short to say, it really stinks to see this happening to Tsunoda. I think that he's a good driver, and it's sad that he is operating one of the top teams and he's putting the car in last. I don't think that's a fault of his own. It makes me wonder about the environment that he's in. It's crazy. There's been a lot of people speculating about, Isaac Hadjar. Like, that's really their only option that's left at this point. And I don't want him to go in there because he's been doing so good as a rookie. I don't want him to end up the way that Liam Lawson has, the way that Tsunoda is, the way that Checo did. Even like going back to Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon, it's like they like destroy them. And I'm like, don't do that to Hadjar. Just let him develop for a little while first, please. So at the end of Q1, we had Hülkenberg, Ocon, Sainz, Colapinto, and Tsunoda get knocked out. Then we can move on to Q2. Actually, Rosberg was super critical of Albon's lap. It was actually really interesting to hear his takes on whenever he didn't hit the apex, things he could have done better to maintain his tires. It was super interesting. For a moment, before everybody else had set a lap time, Bortoleto was second fastest, and I was like, whoa, and then everybody else set a lap, and then it didn't really work out for him. There was also a moment where Russell, he basically did his lap and he was like, oh, I'll be happy to give Kimi a tow if you want. That's a very confident thing to say, to be like, oh yeah, I will give my teammate help in qualifying because I know I'm that much faster than that person. It's a very, first of all, like a leadership thing, I think, just being the leader in that situation, but also just a helpful teammate. Like, it means that you're really looking out for them, but at the same time, it's like, again, that confidence that you are going to be better than your teammate even with your help. It's got to be a good position to be in. At the end of Q2, we had Albon, Bortoleto, Lawson, Stroll, and Behrman get knocked out. Then moving on to Q3, it was basically a battle between Norris and Piastri. Rosberg was saying that he thought that Norris looked like he was really just over driving. It was also a really good showing for Fernando Alonso, who definitely needed that. I have been rooting for Alonso this whole time, and he finally got his first points this weekend, but we'll get into that a little bit more later. In the end, our qualifying lineup looked like Oscar Piastri on pole, Norris second, Verstappen third. Then we had Russell, Hamilton, Antonelli, Leclerc, Pierre Gasly, Isaac Hadjar, and Fernando Alonso in 10th. Moving on to the actual Grand Prix itself, the race day. I have so much to talk about. I have so many thoughts. Oh my gosh. This is why I have this podcast, is so I can get all of these thoughts out into the world. But let's start with the fact that Lance Stroll actually withdrew from the Grand Prix. He did not participate. Unfortunately, he had issues with his wrist, which, if you guys remember, I believe back in the start of 2023, he broke his wrists and he recovered super quickly. He wanted to get back in that car super fast, and honestly I had a lot of respect for him at the time for jumping back in. I think that makes the mark of a real racing driver, but at the same time it's not always the healthiest or smartest option because it's clearly coming back to bite him now, and he has to have a procedure on his wrist to help with that pain. It surprised me that he was able to go through qualifying and then he withdrew from the race. I'm surprised that they didn't have any inclination that he might not be able to race prior to that, because once you do qualifying, you can't put a reserve driver in there, which really sucks for Aston Martin, who looked pretty good on the track this weekend. It would have been really good to have two drivers on the track on a weekend where they're actually capable of getting points. So definitely sad to see, and I obviously wish Lance Stroll the best in his recovery and hope that he is able to make it back for the Canadian Grand Prix, but we shall see. As I said, it was a tough weekend for Williams. Sainz had that really tough qualifying. Even Albon, I mean, he was out in Q2. It's like one of the only times that they haven't gotten into Q3 this year. They've been pretty consistent with that. During the race itself, both of them had issues with their front wings on the opening lap. Albon had contact with one of the Saubers, and then he came in, changed his wing and then came out again. And a little bit later in the race, he had some contact with Liam Lawson, which he actually got a 10-second penalty for gaining an advantage. And so they decided to just retire the car because they'd probably run out of wings at that point, because Sainz had to have a very long stop as well to replace his nose cone, and then that just put him at the back of the track. And it's just not a track that suits Williams in general. I don't think they've ever really been strong here, but it does suck for Sainz because this is his first time not finishing in the points at his home Grand Prix since his debut here in 2015. So definitely not ideal, but hopefully on to bigger and better at the next race. I mentioned Lawson had that little incident with Albon. He actually had a couple of incidents. I felt like they kept talking about Lawson, about him getting in the way during qualifying and during the race, actually. He had another little issue with Behrman as well as one with Alonso at the start of the race. I'm pretty sure the Behrman one got investigated. I'm not entirely sure how that one panned out in the end. And then the other major highlight, I think, of this race was the fact that Antonelli, he unfortunately broke down. His engine just gave out, which led to him to DNF. It definitely sucks for Antonelli. I mean, it's good that at the very least it wasn't something that was his fault. I think that, it affects your confidence a lot whenever you DNF because you crash or you do something silly on your own or whatever it may be. But it's still really disheartening whenever it's something that is so out of your control that you're just like, what could have been, But the fact that he DNF'd did lead to the whole exciting restart situation that kind of made this whole race worth watching, in my opinion. But we'll get on to that. The restart did result in Leclerc actually getting on the podium for the second week in a row, which we love to see. I love my Ferraris up there. Hamilton, however, was definitely struggling in comparison to Leclerc. Hamilton was in front of Leclerc early on in the race, and they made them swap, which I'm sure a 7-time world champion hearing that is not going to be the happiest ever. That is definitely less than ideal for Hamilton. I don't know why he just can't seem to come to grips with this car. It's been like a third of the way through this season now. We're like 9 races in. I would have thought by this point that things would be settling in a little bit, and I want to give him the grace of just, getting used to the new team, but I'm also like, how much longer can we milk that excuse? He's supposed to be one of the best drivers in the world, and he is, but at the same time, I'm like, is he just past a point where maybe it makes sense for him to have gone to another team? That might be a little bit of a hot take, but that being said, I love Hamilton. I love him at Ferrari. I hope that they can keep on improving and he and the team are able to figure out the best options for him and to get him winning again. But anyway, as I mentioned, he was really struggling to the point that actually a Sauber finished in front of him. Nico Rosberg managed to finish in 6th place, which is actually insane and so exciting for the Sauber team because I know that they've really been struggling in a lot of the races so far this season. So I'm sure it felt amazing for Hulk to be up there super high in front of a Ferrari, even though it was sad for the Ferrari. Okay, the minute I have been waiting for, we need to talk about what happened with Verstappen, and that whole restart incident situation it was dramatic. I was jumping up and down. I was like, this is crazy. This is absolutely insane. I cannot believe that this is happening right now. But we have to go back a little bit before we can kind of get into that entirely. Max Verstappen actually went on a 3 pit stop strategy, which was interesting, and I feel like definitely not something that we typically see. It is exciting to know that whenever you're not the fastest car in the field, these teams are experimenting with different strategies to try to still get up there and win the races, and it looked like Verstappen was going to be a real threat. The McLarens were pushing, they were aware of what was going on, and they were like, okay, we have to go. We need to be pushing throughout this. And then there was the safety car for Antonelli, and everybody came into the pits, including Verstappen, and they actually put him on hard tires, which was definitely an interesting choice, and I think the beginning of the end for Verstappen during this race, because he was just so confused why they'd put him on hard tires, and he was just like, this is dumb, and it was a very interesting choice. They were kind of like, well, this is the only thing that we have left, which is fair, but if they knew that they were going on a 3-stop strategy, I think that they probably should have pulled the hard tires for maybe a different point in the race. I just think that could have been thought out a little bit better. But on the restart, there was just a lot going on. So before they even got really to the line, as they were going along the straight, it looked like Verstappen just kind of lost his back end. He had this major wiggle that happened, and at that point, that kind of allowed Leclerc to go in front of him, and I think they had a little bit of contact as they were getting around. Leclerc got in front, it was fine. But Verstappen was already on the radio extremely angry that Leclerc had hit him. And then Russell actually hit him later, and Verstappen had to go into the escape lane. So technically he wound up in front of Russell. And then it was very clear, like, it looked like it was Russell's fault. I mean, I assumed it was Russell's fault. It seemed like it was fine that Max should stay in front of Russell, but his team disagreed, and they told Max that he should let Russell go past. And it was an argument on that radio. He sounded like a little frustrated child, I'm not gonna lie, arguing. And to be fair, I actually do think that Verstappen was right. I think even the stewards later were like, no, we weren't going to give him a penalty. We weren't going to make him give up that position and give it back to Russell. He was in the right. So I can understand Verstappen's frustration. That being said, I don't think that should give him the right to crash into Russell by like faking like he was going to let him go past. Like, that was actually crazy, guys. Like, I cannot believe that happened. And I know in the moment there are so many things going on. There are so many emotions. You're in a very high adrenaline state. There's a lot of frustration going on clearly between the hard tires, just the adrenaline of like getting hit and doing the restart and all of that kind of stuff. And I do wonder, I know Max and Russell have a little bit of beef anyway, so I do wonder if this incident would have been the same if it had been a different driver. Either way, I was surprised at how little of a penalty Max actually got. He got a 10-second penalty, which did move him from like wherever he was, fourth at that point, down to 10th, which is just silly because obviously he was going to get punished for that. I don't know what he was expecting in that moment. It looked very deliberate. I think that he has just about admitted that it was not his best moment or his best move. I just think it's like a 4-time world champion should be a little bit more careful. Like, he is a role model for so many people, as he should be because he is extremely talented. But no one likes a sore loser. Like, sometimes incidents happen, people make mistakes. Like, that was just not the way to handle it at all. And I'm sure he's getting a lot of slack. I'm sure that he is disappointed in himself. And I'm sure that he is regretting his decision, if only for the fact that he lost a lot of points. So, and I like to think he's disappointed in himself because he knows he's a role model and that was not the right move to make. But it definitely made for a very entertaining race. As I said, I think he was in the right until he put himself in the wrong. It could have been fine. It would have been frustrating, but it could have been fine. So it just sucks that all went down the way that it did. Okay, with that said, let's go through the race results. So we had Piastri, Norris, and Leclerc as our podium. In fourth, we had Russell. Fifth, Hülkenberg, because again, I thought that Hülkenberg was in sixth, but I guess because of Max's penalty, he got pushed up in the rankings, which is crazy. So top 5 was a Sauber. Sixth, Hamilton. Seventh, Hadjar, Gasly, Alonso, Verstappen in 10th due to that penalty. Lawson 11th, Bortoleto, Tsunoda, Sainz, Colapinto, Ocon, Behrman, and then Antonelli and Albon DNF'd. That, for our current standing, puts Oscar Piastri in the lead with 186 points, with Lando Norris following closely behind with 176 points. That's still neck and neck, guys. That is close. And then in third, Verstappen is still up there with 137 points, but that gap is definitely growing between them. In fourth, we have Russell with 111, and fifth is Leclerc with 94. For the Constructors' Championship, we have McLaren running away with it, really. I mean, they've got 362 points compared to second, which is actually Ferrari at 165 points. Very exciting to see Ferrari up there. I think that I've kind of been harsh on them this year and assuming that they haven't been doing that great, but then you see that they're second in the Constructors' Championship and you realize, okay, maybe it's not so bad. Third is Mercedes with 159, and fourth is Red Bull with 144. So 165, 159, 144, those, like, Second through fourth positions are very, very tight, and they're going to continue to be so, I'm sure. Then we have Williams as the best of the rest with 54, Racing Bulls 28, Haas with 26, Sauber and Aston Martin both have 16, which is crazy that Aston Martin and Sauber are tied. Would have expected more from the Aston Martins. And then in 10th, we have Renault with 11. So for today's technical tidbit, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about dirty air because it was something that Rosberg was bringing up a ton as he was commentating. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about it. Dirty air kind of plays a major role in everything from overtaking strategy to how the car feels for the driver. And we'll also talk about how it connects to slipstream, and look at how this turbulent air impacts grip, cooling systems, and even the driver confidence. So what exactly is dirty air? So when a Formula One car slices through the air, it creates a wake of turbulence. So think about whenever like a speedboat goes over a lake, it separates the water and it creates a wake effect. The same thing is happening with the air. And unlike clean and smooth airflow, dirty air is very chaotic and unpredictable. And it's full of low pressure vortices as well as distributed currents, which just drastically affect the aerodynamic behavior of the car that hits it. So why does this occur? So Formula One cars are designed to generate massive amounts of downforce by manipulating the way that the air flows around and under the car, specifically the front wing, the rear wing, and the floor. I actually talked about ground effect a couple of weeks ago, and this definitely comes into play with this. But here's the catch. Downforce is created by accelerating air and redirecting it in ways that inherently disturb it. The whole point of a Formula One car is to mess up the air, basically. So when the air exits at the rear of the car, it's being spun, it's being swirled, it's being moved around, tossed around, thrown around, essentially just making it dirty and a lot more unpredictable. So the better the aero package, the worse the dirty air is going to be for the guy behind. So not only are you going faster, but you're also messing up how fast the guy behind you can go, which is interesting when you think about it from an overtaking perspective. It's like sabotaging the guy behind you, and it's totally allowed. Okay, but here's where it gets a little bit interesting in how slipstream comes into play. So slipstream, or drafting, is basically the same thing as dirty air. So in the slipstream, the car behind sits in that low pressure pocket, and this actually reduces the amount of drag that car behind receives, because with generating downforce, you often do generate drag as well. But in the slipstream, you don't have as much air that you have to go through, so then you're able to accelerate and gain speeds a lot more easily, which is really great whenever you're going in a straight line. However, as soon as you are entering some kind of cornering situation, you want to have as much downforce as you possibly can. You don't want less air at that point. You want that air to create that downforce, and so that's when dirty air and slipstreams become a problem. So in the corners, the car experiences a significant loss of downforce, sometimes up to like 40% depending on the corner and the track. And that's just because it doesn't flow the way that it's designed to flow over the aerodynamic elements of the vehicle. So that means less grip, earlier braking. A lot of drivers complain about there being more understeer. And then you also just have a harder time in general because then you lose the feel of the car and what you're used to, and so you're having to deal with a whole new set of variables. And it doesn't also just affect grip, like the cooling systems of these vehicles, you have to take in a lot of airflow to make sure that everything cools down correctly. That's the engine, the brakes, and other internal components that is channeled through tight ducts and radiators, but when that air is dirty and it's turbulent and it's unpredictable, it's less dense, so then there's less cooling efficiency. The radiators and the brake ducts, they get the air at inconsistent flows, and then that can lead to overheating, which is obviously just another issue in and of itself. And then, as I mentioned, it just affects the whole driver feel, and they just can't predict things the exact same way as they can whenever they are in the clean air. The car can slide a lot more. It's also a lot more physically demanding and mentally exhausting because you're wrestling with a car that isn't responding to your feedback the way that you think it should. So next time you hear a driver complaining about being stuck in dirty air, now you know why. There's a lot more elements. You don't just want to be in that top speed ever. It's about trying to create that dirty air, I guess, for the guys behind you and trying to avoid it if you are the one behind. It's also why a lot of new regulations focus on trying to diminish the amount of dirty air effect that happens in order to make that racing more exciting and a lot closer together. Okay guys, that was all for today's episode. I hope that you guys enjoyed. If you did, then make sure to like the podcast, leave a comment, follow, subscribe on whatever platform you are tuning in on. I appreciate all of your support, and I will see you again soon. Also, don't forget to follow our Instagram at GridGirlsFormula, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye!